Well, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon for the NASH TS3 HIPS webinar on Scaling High Impact Practices Part 1, The System Perspective. I'm Claire Jacobson, the Director of NASH's Taking Student Success to Scale High Impact Practices project. Today I'm joined by representatives from the 4 NASH TS3 HIPS systems, who I'll be introducing in just a moment. First, I'd like to take a moment to very briefly introduce NASH and the TS3 HIPS project, because we always have some new members on these webinars. As the representative of the chief executives of the 46 colleges and university systems of public higher education in the United States, the National Association of System Heads, or NASH, harnesses the power of cross-system collaboration to increase student success in college, especially for low-income and underrepresented minority students. In 2017, NASH was fortunate to be awarded $1.2 million from the Lumina Foundation to focus on scaling high-impact practices. NASH selected the University System of Georgia, the Tennessee Board of Regents, the Montana University System, and the University of Wisconsin System to form the TS3 High-Impact Practices Network. Two of the primary goals of this network are to advance the scaling of high-impact practices with a particular focus on underrepresented and first-generation students, and to develop new approaches to defining and measuring quality. Today, we will hear from representatives of the 4 systems about their work. These 4 systems epitomize the changes we see in the role of systems. So today we'll hear from Joe Teal from Montana University System, Carleen Van de Zand from the University of Wisconsin System, Melinda Connor from the Tennessee Board of Regents, and I should note it's now Dr. Connor. She just got her PhD in August, so this is the first time I think she's been with us as Dr. Connor, so shout out. And Jeff Galley and Robert Todd from the University System of Georgia. Just briefly, I wanted to set the stage with a little bit of thinking of systems and what we've learned from the TS3 HIPS network about the changing role of systems. And I will note this will be sort of like the 30-second to 60-second drive-by tour of systems, and then we'll be diving into this with the systems themselves in sort of 2 of these areas. But in general, we see systems moving from a primary focus on compliance and oversight to acting as a network hub for innovation. And several of the benefits of working as a system that campuses in this project have particularly drawn out through our work fall into sort of 4 broad areas. And one is vision. We regularly hear from the campuses that one thing systems can do is create a shared language and understanding. That in bringing together initiatives through a shared vision, they can diminish the all too familiar initiative fatigue. Another thing that systems can do, and one that I find particularly interesting, is create a safe community, and one that allows room to experiment and also to fail. Because I think we all know that sometimes our best successes come first through stumbling. Another thing systems can do is resources, and this probably isn't a surprise. But what might be a surprise is that financial resources were not the first thing that campuses noted when discussing resources. Instead, they noted things like bringing people together, providing a space and time to work, access to vetted resources and experts. And they did in fact note financial resources, but these other things like space and time and access to trusted information, people that they might not otherwise get easy access to, were actually things that they noted more often and first. Communication. This is tied very much to vision, but noting how do the pieces still fit together? You know, what are we doing and why? And how do we decide when to start, and perhaps more importantly, how to stop something? So tied to vision certainly, but communication. And finally, scale, which is what we'll be focusing on today. So systems can certainly act as levers of efficiency and effectiveness, providing synergies and economies of scale. But perhaps the slightly new nuances to this work is the focus on quality and equity. And what does that mean for the change in incentive structures, moving from typical rewards on inputs to outcomes focused on student achievement? And so today's webinar will focus on the system's role as catalysts and incubators for scaling quality and equity initiatives. First, Joe Teal from the Montana University System and Carleen Van de Zand from the University of Wisconsin System will discuss what quality HIPs mean in their system and how focusing on HIPs can help move the conversation about quality beyond rote measures. then Melinda Connor from the Tennessee Board of Regents, and Jeff Galley and Robert Todd from the University System of Georgia will discuss how they are taking an equity-minded approach to scaling HIPS, especially in terms of faculty development. Before I hand it over to Joe and Carlene, a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you within the next 2 weeks. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat box. Also note that there's a part 2 of this webinar series which focuses on scaling from a campus perspective and will be on November 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So with that, Joe, I'm going to ask you to please share your screen and take it away.
Thanks so much, Claire, and thanks everyone who's joined the webinar today. This has really been, I think, an interesting and exciting project for Montana, and a lot of what Claire talked about in terms of the role of systems have been items that this grant has helped us in the Montana University system learn and develop in terms of convening, creating time for campuses, being a linker and a networker in addition to being a resource provider. So excited to talk through some of those items today. You know, one of our first questions kind of coming into this grant are, for the Montana University system, what role do high impact practices play? And, you know, I think that everyone joining this webinar has some sense of George Q's original listing, but when it came to the state conversation, to the system conversation, we found that really they gave us a new language, and they gave us a new language in particular for quality learning. So in Montana, as in many states, we've had many initiatives focused on student success broadly, focused on retention and completion in particular. And, you know, what we found was those are very, very important conversations. They're often driven by the fact that retention and completion are items that we can measure easily. And as we've gone along, you know, there's often a nod towards quality and nod towards the importance of transformational education, but not necessarily an easy language with the rich set of stakeholders that a system interacts with to talk about what quality learning means. And so, you know, you'll hear a little bit from Carlene in her discussion about the interdependence that we all see and want to emphasize more and more between the value of higher education, equity goals in higher education, retention and completion, and quality. And for us in Montana, high impact practices were that language that allowed us to start making some of those linkages. And I just want to emphasize, you know, kind of how that plays out for different stakeholders. So, you know, oftentimes our retention and completion strategies in Montana play out amongst administrators, staff, and policymakers who see strategies and work through them. High impact practices do influence retention and completion, but they influence it by making students' experience in higher education more meaningful, impactful, high quality, and tied to learning outcomes. And because of that, it connected in different ways to different groups. One group that I think was most important in this project was how the language of high impact practices impacted faculty. You know, faculty often didn't connect on an implementation level with some of our prior retention and completion work, whether it be through co-requisite design, math pathways, degree maps, but they connected deeply with high impact practices because they saw these practices as being tied to what brought them into wanting to be teachers in the first place, as the practices that lead to transformations in their students. The second group is policymakers. You know, policymakers are interested in student outcomes and how higher education transforms students. And for these policymakers, this provided some means to address concerns about quality. Are we actually, while we're focused on driving retention and completion, ensuring that when a student completes, there's skills, transformation, all of the things that we're hoping higher education accomplishes is coming along with that certification or that degree. And similarly for employers, high impact practices give us a chance to articulate how education's changing, how it's less didactic and more experiential, and how that experiential learning leads to better, more capable employees. And so in Montana, a lot of our consideration has been, as we've gone through this scaling of high impact practices, how do we use it as a language for quality in our state? And we found a few ways I'd like to share. One is integrating faculty into this good student success conversations that we've been having in new ways. And for us, that was by holding statewide convenings that mixed both faculty and kind of our typical student success teams. And this is one example, a service learning convening that was held at Salish Kootenai College. We had 2 others as a part of this grant that have been building kind of the quality conversation organized by HIPS into a broader system vision on student success that touches on equity and quality. The second piece is how we both recognize teaching excellence and leverage communities of practice. As Claire mentioned, one of the big resources that we found that as a system we could provide was just focused time for different campus teams to come together, to learn from each other, to learn from some of the national conversations that the system was hearing, and to really facilitate that work to create these larger communities. And we saw through some of these convenings that there's a lot of thirst at the faculty level to have similar communities of practice when it comes to these high impact practices experiences. And as a result, borrowing from our good friends in Georgia, and thank you, Robert, for some of your good advice to this end, we're launching a Regents Teaching Scholars initiative that will support faculty learning communities focused around different high impact practices in the coming year. And our hope is that those learning communities will continue forward, that this Teaching Scholars program is something that we'll be able to continue in the future. And then the last piece that we're just starting to work on, I'm excited to turn it over to Carlene, because Wisconsin has made great strides in this area, is developing a common language in a lot of different ways. So I've talked about HIPS being a useful inroads into the conversation of quality in higher education. For us to have that conversation as well as we can, we need to develop some commonalities of what do we mean by quality? What high impact practices delivered at what level kind of count towards that meaning? And for faculty, for administrators, for campuses, what are some best practices? What are some frameworks that we can use when understanding what components of a high impact practice are actually high impact, and making sure that those components are known, are understood, are shared as campuses are seeing how these integrate into their everyday practice. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carlene.
Thank you, Joe. And I really like how Joe presented the broader landscape, and I will come in now and talk about some specifics about quality that we have identified in Wisconsin. Please advance. This webinar is about the role of system and the role of system as motivators. And in Wisconsin, we like to see our system and call ourselves a backbone organization so that we can be facilitators for our campuses. You see on this slide, there are 5 qualities of high impact practices that we have derived as a system, both from national definitions that are broadly reflected, and also these qualities reflect some things that we have held up as a system as important. So the qualities, again, are broadly defined at the system level so that the institutions then can customize these qualities to fit the high impact practices on their campuses. I feel that we're all going the same direction across our campuses with these high level qualities, and yet they are very nuanced at the campus levels, and especially in the assessment of student learning. So very broadly defined, our qualities are that high impact practices have a reflection and metacognition component. There's sustained effort resulting in a major accomplishment. There's vetted demonstration of outcomes, and those outcomes have to do with persistence, increased engagement, interpersonal competence, and writing proficiency. And I'll be giving some examples. Integrated and applied learning, and you'll recognize that as one of the AAC&U learning outcomes. We felt that really aligned well with the type of work that students are doing in high impact practices. And we've also added equity-minded, and in particular, equity-minded practices in the classroom. And before I go further, I'd like to say that these qualities are represented in learning outcomes, in course content, and also in the organization and pedagogy of high impact practices. So our analysis of the qualities and how they are manifested each of our institutions for the high impact practices that they've selected for this NASH project, again, fall into those three buckets, so those three notions. Before we go further, I would like to read a definition that we are using for equity so that we are all on the same page. And our work comes out of the equity scorecard work by Estela Mara Bensimon from the University of Southern California. Equity-mindedness is the perspective or mode of thinking exhibited by practitioners who call attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. These practitioners are willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of their students and critically reassess their own practices. So this is the broad definition, and it's been manifest in very unique ways on our campus. We also are making that relationship of equity and quality, and that's what this webinar is about. And you have a notion of equity in our definitions of qualities. You can advance. And in doing so, making that connection, we know that quality assurance and the furtherance of equity are interdependent. And we're looking for that interdependency when we define quality of an educational practice. We also know that quality assurance must promote equity. And again, we're looking for both of those attributes together. This work spills over into other quality indicators of our work here at the system level. In particular, we're looking at our policy and looking to see which policies are supportive and which policies may be barriers to student success and student advancement. So interrogating our policies for these perspectives. This morning I came from a meeting of another higher ed system within our state of Wisconsin, and we were looking at transfer and looking to see which students transfer easily and which students seem to be facing barriers in transfer. And it also applies to looking at credit for prior learning and how that is applied in student outcomes. Our data collection processes at system, we can report how many students persist and complete, how many number of graduates we have, but then we're asking for deeper analysis and reporting back which student groups, how do different student groups experience their higher ed experience across our campuses. And lastly, in the topic of professional development, that notion of quality, what we are standing for, quality and equity, have been the topics of numerous professional development seminars and webinars that we've had around the state. I'd like to give you some specific examples now from our campuses, thank you, Joe, on how quality and equity are, or how these qualities are manifest. For example, in first year seminars, activities that require reflection and metacognition. One institution said that students have the opportunity to write and reflect on their learning and adjustment to the university life in a first year seminar. And in one sample prompt, the instructor asked students to take a skills inventory survey and to reflect on that. Another example of Metacognition is in a student work experience as a high impact practice. I believe this is at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where students periodically are asked to reflect on a problem that they've solved, interacting with clients, preparing and implementing events, and steps that the students took to address the problem. The situations, the reflections, the skills applied are discussed periodically and regularly with meetings with supervisors. Another activity where students were asked to conduct systematic best practice reviews of campus sustainability issues and to report on that. Looking at evidence of sustained effort over time, culminating in a major accomplishment, students were asked to engage in a research process for at least one semester that is scaffolded across the curriculum. Or students have been asked to demonstrate through presentation and discussion at the first year seminar symposium the results of a sustained course project. So you're beginning to hear these attributes in the examples that I'm sharing. And I have hundreds of these. Students have been asked to develop a description of their internship experience that identifies and documents transferable skills gained to be included on a resume. So you see students transferring to the work experience as well. And then let me just get to an equity-minded, because people are very interested in that. Equity-minded actions that demonstrate an individual's capacity to recognize and address racialized structures, policies, and practices that produce and sustain inequities. And in a freshman seminar, students were asked to consider and discuss a wide array of projects in their first year seminar that validate the cultural backgrounds, knowledge, and identities of diverse students and provide a venue for learning and exchanging knowledge about their cultural backgrounds and communities. Students are encouraged then in an equity-minded pedagogy to have dialogue with diverse community members, those from differing backgrounds and perspectives, after training that they've had for just and culturally humbled discussions. So I hope that it's just a smattering of examples, but you see how we have operationalized these discussions. And one of the questions then that we have is, we want to know how you position equity in the discussions about quality at your institutions. Is equity a component of the discussion about quality? What are the quality indicators that you look for in educational experience? And how does your state or system talk about the quality of student learning? Joe, did you want to chime in on any of those?
You know, Carly, not necessarily, but if I'm right, Claire, this is a time where we can take some questions or some comments on these questions from other systems or other campuses on the call.
Yeah, it'd be great to get some feedback from people on the call, and then we have just a couple minutes, and then for any questions people might have or responses or other questions you want to pose, Carleen and Joe, and then we'll shift because we would like to leave some time at the end for questions. So if you want to type your question into the chat. We have a modest sized group, so if you're able to unmute yourself, we can try that. Just please remember to remute yourself.
I think while people are thinking, it is challenging to ask these questions at the system level. I think we have many examples at the institution level and the department and program level. But when we started looking at our work as a system, that was challenging to be able to answer it in a way that does justice to all of the practices that are going on around the system. Plus, it's challenging to establish the forum in which to ask and answer these questions.
So I do have a question.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Kirti Selly, and I'm on the faculty at California State University, Dominguez Hills, which is one of 23 universities in the CSU system, 9 of which have, well, all 23 actually have undergraduate programs. I also serve as a statewide senator with the Academic Senate of the CSU. And my interest is both professional as an individual faculty member, but also who's engaged in undergraduate research, as well as service learning, community engagement type projects with her students, or whose students are engaged with her in that capacity, but also at some system, university-wide and system-wide level issues. For me, one of the big issues, one of the big challenges to be addressed, and in a sense, it's a huge opportunity, is getting our largely first generation college students, sometimes first generation high school graduates, engaged in writing and communicating in writing from the get-go, whether they come in as freshmen or as transfer students. And so I'd like to learn from you because we're speaking about the system-wide level, what sorts of, in addition to reflective writing, what sorts of practices are you seeing that have been institutionalized system-wide? And then secondly, what's the data? You've presented some very interesting practices, but what's the source of the data? Is it faculty self-report? Is it service learning offices submitting things to the chancellor's office? I'd like to sort of understand both of those things. What are the strategies you're seeing for engaging students in writing besides just the reflective writing you've been speaking about? And two, what are the sources of data that you're speaking about for these practices that are not so simple as simply graduation rates and retention rates and so on?
Carlene, maybe I can start talking about the second piece. And I think that the source of data is a really challenging question, as you mentioned. The approach that I think the systems on the call have taken and are at different levels of implementing is to develop some minimum definitions of practice, at least for curricular high impact practices. So that those minimum definitions can then be applied and vetted through kind of the course development, course scheduling process, where faculty would self-identify those courses as carrying such an experience. And different systems have implemented that in different ways. In Montana, we have a statewide common course numbering system for undergraduate courses that does capture some of the experiences that are purely standalone. But a lot of what we want to be understanding is, a semester long working directly with a faculty member undergraduate research experience, should likely, if it carries some of these quality components that Carlene's mentioned, be counted and captured. But do we also want to be able to capture lower intensity experiences that might be more common at our two-year institutions, for example? And if so, how are we defining those lower intensity experiences, and what's kind of the shared language around that tracking? And those are questions that I think that all of us in all of these different systems are working on and experimenting with to see if we can get a deeper picture of these student experiences than we have currently. I don't know, Carlene, if you have some comments on the writing intensive question in particular.
I'll also chime in a little bit more on the data that we have institutions that collect institution-wide data on particular learning outcomes, having to do with written and oral communication. And then some of our institutions have developed rubrics for writing, and those rubrics are used in common, of course, across several different courses and across time in a student's time at the university. From a system perspective, we also gather data on individual students having to do with retention, persistence, completion, graduation, follow-up, and we disaggregate the data and send those data back to the institutions so that they can have discussions. So data collected and not shared is not helpful, but data collected and shared will definitely contribute to the quality and equity discussions. A couple of the demonstrations of outcomes having to do with writing proficiency that we have collected. Students complete substantive writing and oral assignments linking the course objectives within community-based and service learning experiences. Students are also assessed on how they communicate problem solving in written format. And students write evaluations of their community-based experiences. So you've got the context of a high impact practice and students are writing. And let me see. Oh, students also share evaluations and develop a theory of practice about the community where they are working. So the institutions have been able to thread written proficiency into many of the experiences in ways that go beyond just reflection. They are explaining, they are problem solving, they are doing action research projects. So there's many different formats of rhetoric that we've observed across high impact practices.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. Thank you. Thanks both. There's a lot more to be said about this, and hopefully at the end we can come back to this and tie together some of the threads, particularly this question Carlene posed that attempts to do that. But given we have equally rich content from our next presenters, I want to move on, and Melinda will be starting off for TBR and then moving on to USG. So Joe, if you could end your share, and Melinda, if you could take over.
Sure. Thanks so much, Claire. Let's see. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carlene. Okay, hi, I'm Dr. Melinda Connor, High Impact Practice Specialist at the Tennessee Board of Regents, the college system of Tennessee. We are unique in that we are a system of 27 colleges of applied technology and 13 community colleges. I primarily work with our 13 community colleges with our high impact practices. We are just now starting to move into adding HIPS to our colleges of applied technology instruction. So that's an exciting time. Our system is also unique in that our state, back as far as 2010 with our Complete College Act, has put in the forefront collegiate completion at a legislative level. So outcomes-based funding and transfer pathways for between community colleges and universities, all public community colleges and universities across the state of Tennessee have transfer agreements so students can easily transfer. And then in 2014, our Drive to 55 initiative came, which meant that we were going to strive to graduate and end up with a percentage of our citizenry, 55% of our citizenry, who had post-secondary credentials, whether it's a certificate, an associate's, or bachelor's, or what have you. So the year after that, 2015, Tennessee Promise, which is a 2-year last dollar free tuition scholarship for all high school graduates in Tennessee, took effect. And just last fall, in fall 18, Tennessee Reconnect does the same thing for adults. It's a 2-year free tuition, last dollar scholarship to allow any of our adults within the state to gain a degree or a certificate. So we've had enrollment boosts. We have lots of incoming students who wouldn't necessarily have thought to come to college otherwise without the free tuition. So we have really focused on student success because we are driving to that 55. We started at, I believe it was 32 or 33%. We are now in the 40s, so we are gaining ground and are proud of it. And we think that high impact practices have a lot to do with that. For this session, we were talking about hips and equity. And I think that, thank you, Carlene, for the lead in there. To talk about equity, I'd like to provide you with some slides from the Center for Urban Education that really put things into focus for me. Equity is different than equality. Equality imagines an equal world where everybody, we provide the same supports for everybody, everybody gets the same thing. But that's fine, except the world isn't equal. As this slide here shows, there are students who get a leg up from the beginning and students who don't have those opportunities, like college educated parents or certain social or socioeconomic status or opportunities for scholarships or internships. So bias and systemic racism are also present for some students, microaggressions and implicit bias. So it's important also to recognize that when the equity is different than diversity, when we say that we want to make a more diverse population, we need to have the underpinnings in place rather than just bringing a diverse population into an already unequal pathway that can create complications. So equity, according to the Center for Urban Education, is indeed a way to redirect our resources toward the pathways that have the biggest gaps, the greatest need to fix the barriers, and to intentionally provide student support by really focusing on our data. As Carlene mentioned, unless we look at the data, we can collect it all day, but unless we actually look at it and identify ways where we can improve with it, it doesn't help us much. And so we use our data to set goals and plan actions, especially for our faculty in the area of HIPS. We are privileged in that our community colleges all have become members of Achieving the Dream as of fall 2019. And through that, they are focusing more on equity-minded practice. What we do know is that improving faculty practices and policies in the classroom by helping them to evaluate and to communicate about equity and to address any unconscious or unintended inequities that might be in their daily work really positively impacts student outcomes. A point that I personally want to make is that if our faculty are experiencing equity within the working environment, it helps them to translate that into the classroom. If they are not, right, then it's more difficult for them. So the focus as a system needs to be on equity within the educational environment as a whole, not just the student experience. At the Achieving the Dream Teaching and Learning Summit, 7 of our community colleges had teams who were able to create equity-minded vision statements. And I felt like this was an excellent exercise, and we've encouraged all of our institutions to do this. And here are 2 examples. Montlow State Community College is going to provide a system to create a culture of inclusion and equity, allowing students and faculty to move forward with a sense of purpose within and beyond the classroom. And so you can see that in Cleveland State, Cleveland Community College supports inclusivity, transparent, relevant, engaging teaching and learning for students and faculty. So having your faculty truly think about, whether it's departmentally or institutionally or even system-wide, what an equity-focused approach looks like for them is helpful in turning the tables to where they are more engaged in thinking about, oh, well, high impact practices can be a part of creating this more equitable environment. I don't know, Claire asked us to share some of the barriers. I think that we may all experience some barriers with faculty in asking them to include HIPS because it is not currently what they're doing, and so they're resistant. But when they can see the why and they see the data behind the why, then it helps them to say, oh, well, I can make these small changes and really gain some student progress and do more student success within my classroom. And some of our institutions are even having their faculty look section by section at student success data based on ethnicity and gender and other demographics to see, you know, maybe where unconscious or unintended bias may lie. So since 2010, this is our overview of what our system has woven together with programs and initiatives and the types of students we serve and the outcomes that we track. So we support students through high impact practices, through co-requisite learning support, through our mindset initiatives. We also have beyond financial aid initiatives that support students, and our digital engagement initiative, which is an open access resource situation. We support our colleges at the system level through helping them to be members of Achieving the Dream, providing academic and financial operations, some shared operations there. We also code our high impact practices, and that's how we collect data on them. As Joe mentioned, we have minimal definitions for, I believe it's 11 high impact practices now here at the system office. So if our faculty and departments deem that this course meets the minimum definition for service learning, it is coded in Banner. And so we from the system level and they at the institutional level can pull that high impact practice data through the coding, and we can see where the gaps lie and how successful we are or are not. We also provide strategic enrollment management and outcomes-based funding formula. And we have adults. We also have the K through 12 pipeline, which includes our dual enrollment students. We have quite a few dual enrollment students. I believe they make up just over 15% of our total enrollment. So, why HIPS? Well, they support our completion agenda in a very effective way. And it's been since 2015, I guess, 2015 we developed our first 6 definitions. And since then, we have noticed that the effects the effects of participating in HIPS done well, and that's something that Jeff and I have talked about. You know, George Q really emphasizes that HIPS only are effective when done well, are positive for all types of students. And right now, or last academic year, and I'm hoping that this academic year is higher. Let's see, 17-18, we had close to 29% of all of our students participating in at least one HIP course. In 2018-19, it was 32%. So we have seen a growth. We are looking forward to more growth, and our early data appears to show that all of our students are benefiting from participation in HIP courses by earning more hours per semester on average and persisting fall to fall at higher rates, which is really important in our 2-year system. Our scaling plan was first to develop the HIP taxonomies so that we could start coding and to get that word out, and to have our institutions conduct their first self-studies based on these definitions as a baseline. Then we provided professional development for faculty through online faculty learning communities and regional and statewide HIP conferences. We are now embedding through this grant. We are very fortunate to be embedding our HIPs into pathways. We are asking that our faculty and our departments to embed at least 3 high impact practices per degree pathway or transfer pathway for students to experience, because there is some early data that has shown that if they experience 3 or more, they are more successful in their degree pathway. We are also working to institutionalize our complete student record and using badging to indicate HIP participation and competencies. We're starting that, I believe, next fall with badges on the syllabi and in the course catalog. So at the system level here at the Tennessee Board of Regents, HIPs are scaled and supported through faculty development, our annual HIP conferences and advising academies, our regional drive-in events, our online faculty learning communities, which I developed based on the 8 quality dimensions for HIPs, and the coordinators for teaching and learning workshop was a new thing we did this summer, and that has been very successful. And I will be going out to our campuses to do faculty development, to spread the word about what HIPs are and how faculty can incorporate them on a higher level. Our online faculty learning communities had our 1 to 2 champions from each campus who were then to go out and lead a faculty learning community themselves on that particular high impact practice. That worked out very well. And then our grant to embed the child in our mindset intervention pilots. Additionally, we have the Open Educational Resource Digital Engagement Initiative and TILT, our Transparency in Learning and Teaching. We are pushing Winklevoss's TILT process because we believe if students can understand what it is they're supposed to do in a very comprehensive way, then they will be able to obtain that expectation. So and Georgia has very similar interventions going on in equity-minded practices. So I'm going to hand this over to Robert.
Hey there, I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, my camera is not working at the moment, and it tells me that I'm going to have to reboot. Don't think that's a good idea right this second. Jeff, I believe you would like to step in and take us forward until we get to my slides. Is that correct?
Would you like me to do your slides?
So, Jeff, can you hear me?
I don't see him. Why don't you go forward? Oh, he's under here. Jeff?
Well, I'll tell you what, I will go forward then if we seem to be missing Jeff.
Jeff?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm here. Somehow I went on mute and then the screen disappeared. I'm not sure if we have quite the time that we had planned, but Robert, if you can hear me, I can do the micro and you can provide the overview of how this fits into the USG system efforts.
Okay.
You have your system time. We're going to be very short on any sort of questions, but if you could try to leave, even just a minute or 2 for questions, that might be nicer. It would be great, people in the audience, if you type your questions in the chat, that would help us try to balance the time.
That sounds great. So if everybody can hear, so Jeff, if you have control of the slides, go for them. Otherwise, I'll click them for you. Ready?
Please, I will let you know. I don't have control of them. I'll let you know. So my first 2 slides were covered so well by Melinda. I'm going to skip to the Robert Frost image of 2 rows diverge in a yellow wood. If you can go to slide 3 or 4. Do we have that?
Yeah, are you seeing them?
I am not, but that's okay. I have a copy in front of me, so I'm ready to go. So what Melinda introduced was the difference between equity and equality, and we're thinking exactly the same way. And we've chosen the pathway of equity, and that's the challenge. And here, through the Chancellor's Learning Scholars Program, we've created a system-wide experiment just to see what that might involve. So next slide. So the way that this program is set up is based upon the learning community, the faculty learning community structure. And we have asked campuses to nominate leading teachers. So we begin with that. We leave it to the provost and the CETLs to communicate with each other and to nominate leading faculty who are also excellent teachers. And then we train them. So backing away from that, in order to provide the content for the training, we selected not uber pedagogies that are associated with specific disciplines, but what I'm calling student success pedagogies. And you can see, well, you may not see on this slide, but they include inclusion, interactive strategies, integrated course design, transparency in learning and teaching, advances in neurosciences or brain-based learning, and all of those we think of as being preliminary or foundational to the development of high-impact practices. So in the first year of this program, we selected the pedagogies, trained those faculty selected by their campuses in central meetings that spanned a couple of days, and then supported them virtually through listservs as they develop communities that involve something like 1,000 faculty across the system. Now in the second year, we've added 4 new pedagogies, same process. The USG office, the CETLs, the directors of the teaching and learning centers, create the workshops, deliver the workshops, and provide a great deal of pedagogical support, logistical support, emotional support, and psychological support for the on-campus learning communities. So the outcomes that we've asked each of the Chancellor's Learning Scholars to provide is a final report in which the voices of each participant are present. And we've asked each participant to analyze, to discuss, to describe at least one significant course change that has been made. Okay, so in the final analysis, this 1,100 pages of final reports contain a lot of distillations of great discussions, course design changes that stem from these various pedagogies that we selected from the very start. So next slide, real quick. Pedagogy and HIPS, how these things interface is, our assumption is that if we begin with award-winning, excellent faculty with a certain kind of spirit of, collegiality and design, and an attitude toward collaborative spirit, collaboration, provide them training, then the conversations themselves will foster innovations and change. The goal is to develop more robust high-impact practice presences on each campus based upon the foundational work of the first year. This year, we're focusing on additional pedagogies, but also the development of high-impact practices. So we have an arc, a trajectory, and that is designing clear assignments, including the students in the classroom, all students, engaging them in the classroom, and then leading them into high-impact practice experiences outside the classroom. So those are the 3 contexts within which the design has been placed. Okay, next slide. The dynamics of these pedagogies, it's pretty repetitive actually. It's like we design these, we engage the students, they experience the high-impact practices with reflection and publication and sharing out. And we've created various forms of measurement. We need to assess what is actually happening. One example of an assessment effort is the mindset study that is currently in process, where those who have studied mindset this first year will be invited to Macon on November the 8th, and we will do a traditional pre-test, post-test of the faculty and of their students. So we're talking about as many as, with the participants included, we're talking about 200 and something faculty and as many as, depending on who does the arithmetic, 30,000 students involved in it. So the outcomes of this to scale, next slide, my last slide, I think this will do it for me, Robert. The last slide is this scaling of a good idea means starting with small and scaling it large. So the small is the faculty learning community, but then intentionally supporting it with system-wide training through the invaluable leadership of the Seatles, and then replicating that across 26 institutions, dispersing it, replicating it, and then sustaining it across multiple cohorts. Okay. The so what test, I'll leave for questions if there's time at the end, and just thank you. This is a fantastic project. We have a book contract that's come out of this. We're doing a larger study in the third year, but all of that is yet to be. So Robert, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Hopefully everyone can still hear me okay. My video will be back later once I reboot. And I hear I went and put on a fancy blazer for this, but that's okay. You'll just have to look at the slides. I'm just going to tell us a little bit about the equity approach as it relates to the system as a whole and to our big system goals, sort of to take the essay we've been doing and then move it back out to the macro level. So how does an equity approach look in Georgia? Primarily it is, you know, as Claire mentioned at the beginning of our talk here, there can be issues with initiative fatigue and similar types of problems. So we're addressing this not as a new separate or add-on approach that can be a danger, but as a portion of the momentum approach for the state, and we are working to make it business as usual. And the way that works here is to look at equity HIPs. If you take a focus, look on the HIPs themselves and the idea of equity, look at faculty learning communities, chancellors, learning scholars, the momentum summits, and the smaller summits and convenings that all build up to those big annual summits, and our work on growth mindset, which we're doing in tandem along with TBR. All is an iterative cycle of decisive action, metrics and reporting, analysis and understanding, and then back to planning before more action. All of that is just an ongoing cycle. Some of you have seen the famous brownie slide. That is not a chunk of wood. That is actually, as some people think, but a brownie. So the idea here for our momentum year as we began it, some of you've heard this, is that you can't look at the creation of a brownie or any other kind of any other kind of a food as a menu. It has to be a recipe, so everything has to be there. If you leave the sugar out, then it's not going to work. So we see all of these pieces underneath momentum: purposeful program choice, productive mindset, clear pathways with a minimum number of hours, academic foci, and the initial completion of English and math as all parts of ingredients and recipe, not just as a menu. And so we're taking this momentum a year forward, and this year is our big momentum approach year, where we are deepening the choices, cultivating those academic mindsets with more research and interventions, maintaining a full momentum with a very clear pathway, heightening academic engagement, and completing critical milestones. And you see a little puzzle to the left here, which shows purpose, mindset, pathway, engagement, and milestones as they all fit together, which is the way we're viewing this, as all part of a puzzle. No one piece can be left out. So what does this really mean for us in terms of equity and HIPs? It means that we have a systemic approach to the development, implementation, and scale of HIPs throughout the system. And we're very deliberately not discussing it as a separate initiative, but simply as an integrated part of that puzzle as we are planning and delivering, and as we're discussing larger equity issues with the data that everyone reports. All of our 26 institutions report annually. So a systemic vision of this might look something like this. Once again, that iterative approach, but with a somewhat different focus, showing how faculty have a role in generating momentum, in designing and delivering those high impact practices per AAC&U and the 8 core elements of AAC&U. Investing institutional capacity to scale campus-wide, which there are several pieces there, two of which I'm going to point out as my brief examples. and then measuring that impact and scaling the impact system-wide. Everything we do with the momentum approach is about data, and then taking the data to prove the case, to move the case and the action along to the next step. So in all these cases, we are looking at the ways we can collect data. You'll see at the bottom, momentum plans, tracking HIPs in Banner, and taxonomies are part of the way we are creating institutional capacity. So these are ways that we're seeing that we can actually make this a part of the whole, and hopefully not have institutions believe that it's simply another one-off kind of approach to yet another idea that sounds good, but really is just a part of the puzzle. Nothing can be left out. And this is a combination of including the HIPs in institutional momentum plans, which they are, and these momentum plans are updated annually, utilizing taxonomies that thankfully TBR helped us with in the beginning, taxonomies for equitable learning pathways, and integrating HIPs in our Banner student information system. And since we're running out of time, I'm going to quickly go to those examples. Those tools are ways that we're hoping to make this equity mindset, equity HIPs, just a part of the way we do business. So mindset, the research, we're checking mindset data for how it can show that our equity approach is either working or not working so well. So with one type of question, we discovered students answering, my family doesn't understand why I want to go to college. On average, about 6.3% of all of those first-time freshmen that we're giving the mindset studies surveys, this year, over 15,000 are receiving that this semester. But among African-American males, that rate was 12.4%. So there we're seeing some of the equity differences that did not show up so well previously, and the mindset data is helping us do that. Also, we've noted by doing correlations that the cumulative GPA at the end of 1 year for students who agree or strongly agree was roughly half a grade lower. So there are real consequences to this type of mindset issue. Another one is Chancellor's Learning Scholars, which Jeff discussed in detail. This is a foremost mechanism for improving instructional practice, and is going to allow us to look at the instructor mindset as well as the student mindsets, as I mentioned in the previous example. And the last two that I want to give, taxonomies, we have 8 common dimensions to all HIPs with 3 degrees of impact in the taxonomies we've created. Thankfully, that Equity HIPs, this project has allowed us to do in a very similar way TBR had attributes that were somewhat similar. Within each dimension, a number of components offering comparisons at each level. And equity in every one of these is dimension number 1, is foremost. And taxonomies we are using as a way that faculty can look at potentially enhancing the equity element within their specific HIPS courses. And so we are scaling out the use of these taxonomies now through our momentum process. And what it does primarily is create dialogue. Meaningful dialogue amongst the constituents in these institutions and between them. And then last, the Banner information system. We have Banner codes for the HIPs that we are specifically targeting in our Equity HIPs project. Here is an example for global learning, which you would think of as study abroad or study away. We can review this data over years, compare it, correlate it to other data on student success. And now that every institution is using this Banner coding and these attributes, we hope as we move forward to have a stronger idea of how these, well, first of all, what coding, what attributes are important in Banner for HIPs, but also how the HIPs are making an impact in students and how they relate to equity among students who are either lower income or students of color, and other students that have traditionally been particularly underserved. So we have codes that are necessary, some duration codes that may or may not be reflective in the particular hip, and then supplementary codes such as these that can help fill out the picture of the hip and what the hip is actually doing for the students. And so again, priorities, integration of hips in our strategies, in our momentum plans, collecting, analyzing data through Banner, and empowering institutions to assess, learn, and innovate through the Chancellor's Learning Scholars and our taxonomies. And hopefully I did that about as quickly as I could to get us close to our end time.
Yes, thank you for that. So again, if anyone has any questions and didn't get a chance to ask them, please go ahead and type them into the chat. I'll leave it open for a couple of minutes, and I'll go ahead and circulate them and try to get you a response. Particularly since we are over time, we will go ahead and wrap up. I really wanted to thank all of our system presenters. I know this was a lot of information in a pretty short time, but I think they did a really nice job trying to distill some of these complicated and complex concepts for us, and to give some highlights of the work that the project has been doing at the system level. As I mentioned, there will be a part 2 of this webinar focused on campus scaling on November 19th. So we hope that you will join us for that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's nice to see systems be talking about scaling focused on quality and equity. If you're interested, there is a fairly new NASH-SHIO report on quality that would provide a nice contrast to this. I think what's so nice is to see the systems really drilling down into what does quality mean and tying these issues together. Often what I've seen in trying to pull together quality is there's not a lot of there always, or there's a lot of it's kind of mushy. So really seeing 4 systems, and certainly others, but the 4 in this project, really take this so seriously and dive in with tools and resources and support, and so much energy has been very rich and rewarding. And I know that this isn't the end of the conversation, but only the beginning. And so I just really wanted to take this chance to publicly thank the hard work of our systems, our 4 systems, and our 22 campuses, and formally, as from the TS3 HIPS project, thank them for the dedication that they've shown. So with that, thanks everyone. And if you're on the East Coast, it's now 5 o'clock, so I hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.